There's a story that's told in Cody, Wyoming. In the fall of 1942, a recent transplant to the town, a rancher's wife living on the South Fork, drove down Sheridan Avenue and was shocked and disgusted by the signs she saw in the business windows. Signs full of racial slurs and threats against the Japanese Americans from the West Coast that had recently been incarcerated at the nearby Heart Mountain camp. The anger that she felt on behalf of those Japanese Americans burned inside of her over the next few weeks. At the next meeting of the Park County Commissioners, she stood up and issued a threat. She reminded the elected officials in the room that 2/3 of the people held at Heart Mountain were American citizens with full voting rights. And she estimated that the number of eligible voters there topped 3,000, more than the entire population of Cody. She warned that if the town didn't adopt a more welcoming tone, she'd organize Heart Mountain into a voting bloc and see to it that every politician in the county was ejected from office come November. Shortly after that, so the story goes, most of those signs started to come down. I'm Dakota Russell, Executive Director of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation. In honor of Election Day today, I thought it appropriate that we dive into the story of voting at Heart Mountain. When the government forcibly removed over 110,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast, little thought was given to the fact that there was an election at the end of the year. The War Relocation Authority, the agency that ran the camps, announced fairly quickly that American citizens of Japanese ancestry would retain their right to vote. That said, even they didn't seem to know exactly where and how the incarcerees would go about voting. Like so many basic problems that resulted from the incarceration, the issue would be decided haphazardly after the fact. On September 19th, as trains were still unloading new arrivals to Heart Mountain nearly every day, the camp administration printed a notice about voting. In the opinion of the solicitor of the War Relocation Authority, it is improbable that evacuees in WRA centers will acquire a voting residence in the state and county where centers are located. Incarcerees were instead advised to request absentee ballots from their state of origin. Most Japanese Americans of the Issei generation, the citizens born in the U.S., felt a responsibility to try and vote. They risked their names being removed from the rolls back home if they didn't, and their immigrant parents, almost all of whom were barred from citizenship and thus could not vote, emphasized the importance of participating. One of the few eligible voters among the immigrant generation, the Issei, was Clarence Uno, who won his U.S. citizenship for service in World War I. He printed a stack of absentee ballot requests and distributed them to young people around the camp. Even so, voting could prove challenging. Most of Heart Mountain's residents had spent the past several months in a state of trauma and shock, trying to figure out basic survival. They were not necessarily current on their home state's political issues. And there was always bureaucracy and red tape. California, for instance, was only processing requests for absentee ballots during a single 2-week period in October. The chaos had the effect of heavily suppressing the Japanese American vote in 1942. In the end, only about 250 incarcerees at Heart Mountain cast absentee ballots. Like their counterparts in Park County, the politicians in the Wyoming state legislature considered the 1942 election to be a disaster narrowly averted. They too were afraid of Heart Mountain, then the third largest city in Wyoming, shifting the balance of political power in the state. In January 1943, they hurriedly passed legislation denying the right to vote to any citizen brought to Wyoming by the War Relocation Authority and, now or hereafter, interned in a relocation center or concentration camp. With their efforts to participate in state and national politics frustrated, Japanese Americans at Heart Mountain focused their efforts on the local scene. The War Relocation Authority made a lot of noise about how the camps were self-governed, even if those governments were largely symbolic and easily overruled by the camp's administrators. In November of 1942, the people of Heart Mountain went to the polls to select block leaders, members of the community council, and representatives to serve on the judicial commission that would settle civil disputes and minor criminal offenses in the camp. One candidate caught the eye of the camp's fledgling newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel. Ruth Hashimoto, the sole female on the ballot, running to represent her block on the community council. The presence of women in the American political picture is one of those things that make life interesting, noted the Sentinel. And so more power to Ruth and any of her sister residents who care to take an active part in the project campaigns. Ruth lost her first bid for office, but went on to represent her block in 1943. Election Day in 1943 was much the same as the year before, with Heart Mountain incarcerees focused on filling the local positions within the camp. Again, only 250 or so absentee ballots were cast. But 1944 would be an entirely different animal. The first presidential election since Japanese Americans were incarcerated, between President Franklin Roosevelt and challenger Thomas Dewey, stirred considerable interest, both inside of Heart Mountain and in the state of Wyoming at large. Cody lawyer Millward Simpson began to fear that the state law might no longer be enough to stop the camp's Japanese Americans from voting. Having established residence for probate and divorce, he wrote, it is now a question whether or not they have established residence from the standpoint of voting. I know of no member of our delegation who would want their vote. WRA head Dylan S. Meyer also created a panic by releasing a statement that competent attorneys had opined that incarcerees were entitled to the right to claim residence and the right to vote in states where centers are located. After the outrage hit a fever pitch, Meyer quickly retracted his statement. In September, 2 Issei soldiers from Heart Mountain lobbed a hand grenade into this powder keg of controversy. Serving in the segregated 442nd Regimental Combat Team and finishing up training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 2 servicemen innocently sent in their requests for absentee ballots to Wyoming Secretary of State Mark Christensen. Everyone waited to see how Christensen would react. Would he really turn down American soldiers seeking to vote? Ultimately, he waffled. He agreed it was unfair to both ask them to fight and deny them their vote, but said that the 1943 law left his hands tied. The state's Attorney General affirmed this position, settling the question in Wyoming once and for all. To some of Thomas Dewey's supporters, all this uncertainty seemed like an opportunity. California Judge Goodwin J. Knight spoke at a number of Dewey rallies in his home state and planted the seeds of a dangerous conspiracy theory. Roosevelt, Knight suggested, had incarcerated Japanese Americans in the western states not to punish them, but instead so that they could turn those states democratic and secure his election. The California nativists who had championed Roosevelt's removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans decided that they liked this story even better. Bill Hosokawa, former editor of the Heart Mountain Sentinel, was stymied by this and other Republican appeals to the nativists. He had naively assumed Dewey's campaign would jump at the chance to call Roosevelt out for incarcerating his own citizens. Instead, Dewey himself dodged the issue, and his subordinates doubled down on it. Heart Mountain voters had no presidential candidate willing to stick up for them. The Sentinel never officially endorsed either candidate, but swallowed the bitter pill and took on a pro-Roosevelt tone. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how Heart Mountain voters responded to all this. The Sentinel never reported how many absentee ballots were sent back to the West Coast, and we know even less about how the incarcerees voted and who they voted for. Roosevelt handily defeated Dewey in California, where most of them would have voted. Just a month after the election was over, the Supreme Court ruled that the government's incarceration of Japanese Americans was constitutional, and that the president had the power to strip the rights and even the liberty of American citizens during wartime. Voting was not officially included among the rights the Issei lost, but the actions, and for that matter the inactions, of both state and federal governments effectively robbed them of their say. Voting rights, like any of our rights as citizens, must be protected not just in name, but in practice. We all deserve to have our voice heard. If you haven't already, take the time to go out and vote today. Thanks for exploring this chapter of Heart Mountain history with me.